She's a principal scientist within RTI International's Applied Justice Research Division. Please welcome to the stage, Dr. Jeri Ropero-Miller.
Thank you, everyone. This is probably as close to being a stand-up comic that I ever want to get in my life. So I am a forensic toxicologist by trade, and what I'm here to talk to you about today is the opioid epidemic. We know how it has been a tragedy for our families and our society and our communities. We know how it affects justice and law enforcement and hospitals, but I doubt many of us know how it is affecting forensic scientists. So that's what I hope to convey to you in the next 5 minutes. So if any of you have not seen headlines like this, even in the last week or two, in the newspaper or a blog, then I need to come check your pulse, because they are out there. And I would say that this is just 2016 to 2022 that I've grabbed a few, but this has been going on for decades. And how to show this is something that CDC did, is looking at what they had described as the waves of the opioid epidemic. So back when I was at the medical examiner's office beginning in 1998, we were dealing with the first wave of the opioids. We were dealing with the prescription drugs, the oxycodones, the hydrocodones, and everything that the pharmaceutical companies were creating to deal with pain management. And so that went on, and then in 2010 is about the time that Wave 2 started. And Wave 2 was when heroin, which was still going on in the background, it really started to take a jump. So you still had prescription drugs going on. Heroin was starting to jump up, and you can see the lines there. And then in 2013, we moved on to Wave 3, which is when the synthetic opioids, like the fentanyls and the fentanyl analogs, came on board. And so all of these are just continuing to go, and each of them are increasing, and some of them, as you can see, are increasing exponentially. And what I've defined here is Wave 4. It hasn't really been identified by CDC, but I think in the next, in the next few months, you'll start seeing what they're calling Wave 4, because we're already seeing it, where we are dealing with the mixtures on the street, where they're putting your synthetic opioids, your fentanyls, in with stimulants. And I don't have time to go into why, but there's a very good reason for why that is happening. And this has been starting to be reported in the 2020. So this particular graph is, I think the New York Times first came out with it in 2014, and they continue to give it to us every year. And if you go back and look at 2014, and the latest one I'll get to in a few slides for 2021, but it's incredible how you see that curve taking place. And actually, I didn't change the number there, but for 2017, you see that the opioid epidemic and the number of opioid deaths had actually gotten to 63,000, not 42,000. That was the original one. And you can see up there at the top where the opioid overdoses have led to death, that that's more than firearms. It's more than deaths caused by HIV, even more than deaths caused by car crashes in the United States. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to go into all of this, but this just is a opioids epidemics by the numbers. What you can see is we're in millions now for many things like, approaching 2 million of people that are misusing not only the prescription drugs, but the newer drugs. And that, in 2020, when this was put out, that 745,000 people were using heroin, and 50,000 of them were using it for the very first time. So these numbers are just crazy, and they continue to increase. When you think about forensic science and medical legal death investigation and trying to figure out why somebody died, medical examiners and coroners, which are the two components that make up medical legal death investigation offices, are trying to solve or figure out two things. One is the cause of death, or what is the medical opinion that is given by a forensic pathologist or another medical doctor to determine what is the disease or the injury that has contributed or resulted in that person's death. The other thing that they're trying to figure out is the manner of death. Now, luckily, there's only 5 manners of death that they have to concentrate on, but that would be accident, homicide, natural, suicide, and undetermined. So of those 5 manners of death, how many would you think you could attribute to an overdose? I'll just tell you that 4 of those you could contribute to an overdose, depending on the investigation. The only one that you should not attribute an overdose to is natural. Okay, so I wanted to set the stage for some of our research, but in 2004, 2007, the reason I wanted to give you these is prior to a study that we did in 2018, we were looking at census data that was coming for death investigation that either had not been done or were done in 2004, and then we didn't get an update for 15 years. So I don't know why that is, but hopefully we will start seeing that they're looking at death investigation statistics a little bit more closely and a little bit faster. But prior to 2017, we saw that the overdoses were already tripling and that there were 21,000 deaths and 1 in 20 investigations that were done by a medical examiner coroner's office was happening. You pump that up or look at it just 3 years later, and that number had already doubled in overdoses, and you are looking at 36,000 deaths, and 1 in 12 that were going to the medical examiner coroner's offices was an overdose that needed to be investigated. Fast forward to 2017 and data that my co-authors and I put out looking at the estimated death toll using 2017 US population and age-adjusted death rates. If you look at that top number, in 2017 there were 2.4 million total deaths in the United States. And of that, only 450,000 get investigated by medical examiner coroner's office, because if they're not unnatural or you don't have a reason for somebody to be dead, then they would go to medical examiner coroners. So that's 450,000. Of that, 70,000 were already overdose deaths. So you're looking at 1 in 34 deaths happening in the United States in 2017 were overdoses. And that was 1 in 6 deaths needing to be investigated by medical examiner coroner's offices, because that's the other thing, is so many of them don't go to the medical examiner's coroner's office like they should. Now, 2021, I will just say that the numbers are still rising. We are at 3.5 million for total deaths. The 450,000 we don't have yet because we're not getting our census except for every 5 years. But that's going to be the minimum it is, and you're already looking at 1 in 4 investigated deaths. There's a lot here, but that's just to say that if you added up all the pieces of the pie here, you're going to get less than 11,000 employees or staff that work in medical examiner coroner's office to do all that work. In comparison, in law enforcement, we have 1.1 million staff that work in these agencies. And if you look at the autopsy pathologists, that's less than 1,000 of them doing the work that they need to do the autopsies. In comparison to other specialties like radiology, surgeon, oncology, that is 2 to 10 times less than what those specialties are. So this is all about workforce pipeline and something we don't have, and we keep having more and more of these types of deaths happening. So remember the first one I showed you with the New York Times? This is the last one that they put out in 2020, showing that we were already up to 93,331. They haven't put up their new one, but the last number that we had in 2021 was actually 109,000 deaths due to opioid overdose. But you can see we're far beating the firearms, HIV, and car crashes. So with that, that's what I have to give you tonight. Thank you.
Excellent. Now it's Q&A time. You've got your questions for Dr. Jeri Ropero-Miller about the opioid epidemic and its effects on forensic science. Oh, look, you're right over here. I'll just go here right now because I don't have to walk as far.
So right at the end, you were talking about how there's not enough staff to deal with this and how there's so much in criminal justice. What do you think like incentivizes people to go in that direction rather than in the like medical direction?
So, well, that could be a very long conversation, but when you look at just the medical profession of a forensic pathologist or a medical student looking at going into forensic pathology compared to any other discipline that they could go in, the bottom line is it takes an additional 2 years for them to get through and get trained to be a forensic pathologist, and then they have to be board certified for it, and their paycheck is so much less because most of these offices are state-run agencies, and the money's just not there.
All right, next question, same spot.
So I also, I noticed that there's 5 types of things that are investigated, and only one of them is homicide, I guess. How often is opioids being used in homicides, or is it just not common? Is it usually normally an accident?
I don't have the exact number, but unfortunately, it's probably more often than you think, just because it is being used for different reasons. I mean, it could be a reason where somebody does a homicide for other crimes that they're trying to commit, and for whatever reason, they're using an opioid to slow them down. Also, in many states, somebody who sells drugs can be charged with that as a homicide if somebody dies as a result, and they can tie it back to them. So there's many reasons that a homicide could be attributed to an opioid death. Those are just 2.
All right, gentleman back here had the hand up first, so I'm going to go back that way.
He's in trouble.
I'd like to first thank you for speaking today, but you mentioned the total number of deaths being in the millions and the investigated being a couple 100,000. And I hate to ask you an unknown, but if you were to give an estimated or educated guess, how many more deaths do you think there would be from opioids if every death were investigated?
Oh, I think it would easily, it would easily double, triple, probably even more than that. I know that I just read an article out there where they were using some type of predictive analysis to look at opioid deaths out to 2032, and they were predicting that on the, I'm going to say this back, on the optimistic side, it would only be 500,000. On the pessimistic side of that predictive thing, it was going to be over 1 million. And that's with the numbers starting to go down in 2025. So, yeah, it'd be more.
All right, last question coming right here in front.
Hi, I'm wondering, as the numbers of overdoses are increasing over time, can you talk about the proportion of those that are first-time users, and has that changed over time?
I can't talk exact numbers. What I can tell you that there is a trend out there for that the risk associated with drug use is just not considered by those that are taking drugs as easily. I'll tell you, when I was in high school, which is just a few years ago, we would never, think about putting a needle in our arm, let alone doing it for the first time we've ever experienced a drug beyond alcohol. Nowadays, you see that trend happening, and that's, again, just one example, but I think that those risk-seeking behaviors and the being afraid of drugs is just not in our society as much as it was, and then, just being able to get access to it. I mean, it's everywhere.
All right, folks, give it up for Dr.
Thank you,
Jeri
everyone.
Ropero-Miller.